Great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Webinar Wednesday. Today's topic is PFAS in public health, an examination of the occurrence of PFAS, their effects, and the evolving regulatory environment, presented by Dr. Jane Kullmann. So as in other webinars, the chat is open to interact with your fellow attendees. Feel free to say hello, where you're from today. If you have questions for our presenter, make sure to put those in the Q&A section, and our presenter will answer them at the end of her presentation. So a little bit about Dr. Kullmann. Jane is a senior human health risk assessor at the National Water and Environmental Engineering firm. She has over 20 years of experience in environmental consulting, human health risk assessment, and vapor intrusion. Key highlights of her experience include independently conducting human health risk assessments and writing accurate and thorough technical reports. Jane has served as a project manager for multiple projects and a task manager for the human health risk assessment and vapor intrusion evaluations. She is a diplomat of American Board of Toxicology and certified in public health. She has a PhD in epidemiology from the University of Sydney, a Master's of Science in Environmental and Water Resources Engineering from Tufts University, and a bachelor's degree in chemistry modified with physics and environmental studies from Dartmouth College. She has presented professionally she has presented at professional and medical conferences and other venues in the US and internationally, and is the author of several peer-reviewed academic articles. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kullmann.
Thanks so much, Ashley. I'm really excited to be here and talk with all of you today. So as Ashley mentioned, I'm a human health risk assessor. I work at a company called Woodard and Curran, and I'm outside of Boston. So it's still cold here. So without further ado, I'll just get started in the presentation. So as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about per and poly-fluoroalkyl substances and public health, an examination of the occurrence of PFAS, their health effects, and the evolving regulatory environment. So an overview of the topics that we're going to cover today. I will talk about what PFAS are and what they are or were used for, their presence in the environment. I'll talk about the concentrations of PFAS in people, the human health effects of PFAS that we've observed, and I'll talk about how PFAS are regulated under the current regs. And then I'll also go over an example of a regulatory determination and how those are applied and derived for the drinking water standards for PFOA, PFOS, and a couple other PFAS chemicals that have drinking water standards. And then I'll also talk about what we can do about PFAS. So what are the options for addressing PFAS in the environment and also disposing of them? So the first topic is a little history of PFAS and their chemical identity. Oop. PFAS are a collective group. There are thousands of man-made chemicals. So there are no naturally occurring PFAS that are known. They're all come from people making them. And just based on their chemistry, there are really like thousands of potential combinations that can constitute a PFAS chemical. They are organic molecules, so they're based in carbon, and their primary quality is that they have a lot of fluorine, which, of course, given the name, seems obvious. So that's really what imparts a lot of their uh, imparts a lot of their characteristics is due to the presence of fluorine in the molecule. So there are a couple of different varieties of PFAS. There are what's called long chain PFAS and short chain PFAS. So long chain just means it has a longer carbon chain. And so for the sulfonic acids, that would be 6 carbon atoms. And then for the carboxylic acids, it's 7. And then short chain would be a fewer number of carbons than either of those. So that's generally how they're categorized in when you read about PFAS, you'll see that mentioned long versus short chain. So the first form of PFAS was polychlorotrifluoroethylene, and that was invented in 1934. And here on the slide, you'll see a monomer of that. So it has the carbon chain and it has 3 fluorines and a chlorine molecule attached to it. So it wasn't 100% fluorinated, it had some chlorine in it. So they actually discovered Teflon by accident in 1938, and that is a perfluoro, so that, or sorry, a compound, so that is all fluorines. And it was used in the Manhattan Project as part of the World War II effort, so they used Teflon in parts of the atomic bombs. So the original PFAS, both the polychlorotrifluoroethylene and Teflon, are both polymers, and so they're repeated versions of the same chemical that form a much larger chemical. So those are the original ones. Um, so as I mentioned, the first PFAS was created in 1934, and then Teflon was discovered in 1938. In 1945, 3M acquired a PFAS manufacturing method that allowed for rapid scaling up of the PFAS manufacturing process. And so this was the first thing that really allowed PFAS to become to be manufactured on a wide scale and at mass quantities. So that's when it sort of really hit the market. DuPont started manufacturing PFAS in 1951. Um, and so the first PFAS chemical was more PFOA, so that's the perfluorooctanoic acid. And then PFOS, the perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, was discovered in 1953 and then also became one of the dominant forms of PFAS in the market. In 1956, I thought this was kind of an interesting tidbit. That's when TFAL was created, and so that's where the name TFAL comes from because it's nonstick cookware coated with Teflon. So therefore, the TEF at the beginning indicated the use of Teflon in those pans. So, what makes PFAS so useful? As I mentioned, they have some unique properties among a lot of chemicals. So they are oil, water, stain, and soil repellent. They also, sort of along those lines, they also reduce friction in when they're used, so they can make things very slippery, and so that's can be a valuable property in industrial and manufacturing applications. They're also chemically and thermally stable, so they don't react with other chemicals, and they're really stable at a lot of different temperatures. They don't react in heat or cold, which is quite unique among chemicals. If you think about a lot of things, if it gets too hot, things can become unstable, and also in very cold temperatures, things can break down, and that's not the case with PFAS. So they're really essentially inert, and I think that really is the basis for the term that a lot of people use to refer to them, which is forever chemicals, because they just don't go anywhere, and it's really hard to break them down. The reason why they're so stable is because of this carbon-fluorine bond, and it's the most stable bond in organic chemistry due to the electronegativity of fluorine as a molecule. So here, if recall perhaps something of organic chemistry or chemistry in general. So I just need to find my pointer. There we go. You'll see I think I had a there we go. There's the fluorine molecule, and you can see that it's up there in the far corner, and it has one of the highest electron affinities of any element on the periodic table. And so this creates extremely stable molecules that are very hard to break down. And so that's really where PFAS gets its stability from. So PFAS have been used in a wide range of industries: aerospace, semiconductors, medical, automotive, construction, electronics, aviation, so almost anything you can think of. And of course, they are and have been used at least in many consumer products. So carpeting, clothing, furniture, anything you don't want to stain to adhere to, it's probably a good candidate for using PFAS. Outdoor equipment, food packaging, and then also firefighting is one of the most well-known. So there's a lot of environmental contamination that exists now due to prior use of what we called AFFF in firefighting activities. And so you'll imagine they especially use them for fires for airplanes for the jet fuel. So it's a very effective firefighting tool for jet fuel, and so you'll see a lot of PFAS sites are related to airports and also military installations because of that. I just thought it was an interesting picture over here. We have Happy Pan, where nothing sticks to Happy Pan because it's coated in Teflon and it's very slippery. Um, so the sort of good news, I would say, is that a lot of PFAS use has been phased out of industry. So the major manufacturers of PFAS, specifically long chain PFAS, have been working with the EPA to phase out their use since the early 2000s. There's also the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants has been used to reduce or eliminate PFAS use more like worldwide, and that really started kind of in 2008, 2009 timeframe. So both in the U.S. and other places in the world have been working on phasing out the use of PFAS in all processes in manufacturing and consumer products. So the PFOA and the related chemicals have been phased out as part of EPA's PFOA stewardship program. Now, this is not to say that they're completely phased out of production, because there are companies that don't participate in the stewardship program and they are still allowed to produce, import, and use PFAS and PFOA. In addition, PFAS can still be present in imported items because they're not subject to the same regulations that you have like inside the United States. So things that come from other places still can have PFAS in them. Nevertheless, all these actions put together have dramatically limited the production and release of long chain PFAS in industry and manufacturing. So, just to say, there are some cases where the short chain PFAS have replaced the long chain PFAS, because, generally speaking, short chain are considered to be less persistent and less toxic than the long chain. That may not be always the case, but that's one thing that they've done in industry to reduce their reliance on long chain PFAS is to switch to the short chain. So just to cover a little bit about how PFAS chemistry works. As I mentioned, we have sort of these two main PFAS chemicals that you will hear about most often, which are PFOS and PFOA. So, talking about PFOS specifically first, if we look at the name there, it's perfluorooctane sulfonic acid. And so, with the PFAS, as we mentioned in the title, you can have perfluoro or polyfluoro molecules. So the perfluoro means that every available carbon bond is is inhabited by a fluorine molecule. So you can see that here with this sulfonic acid. All of these available spots on the carbon chain are filled with fluorine. And so a polyfluoro chemical would have some hydrogens in these spots. So it wouldn't be 100% fluorinated. So in this case, it is an 8 carbon chain. So that's where we get the octane from. So if you're again like going back to chemistry, the oct means 8. So it's an 8 carbon chain. And then in the case of this PFAS, the PFAS, it's a sulfonic acid, and so you have a sulfonic acid at the end of that molecule. And so that's where that comes from. The other types of PFAS are the carboxylic acids, which are represented here by perfluorooctanoic acid. So this is the same in the sense it still has an 8-chain carbon, and it is completely fluorinated, but instead of having a sulfonic acid, it has a carboxylic acid. So that's what's here at the end of the molecule. So it does have that's why it has the one, let's see, I think the sulfonic has technically, it has one fewer connections. So one of the carbons in this molecule is at this carbon oxygen connection down at the end. So that's kind of how the PFAS chemistry works. So you can have butanoic, pentanoic, hexanoic, heptanoic, nonanoic, decanoic. So it goes, all the numbers. Um, so because of those functional groups that we saw at the end of the molecules, the sulfonic and the carboxylic acids, they can be present either in an acidic form, which is with the hydrogen present, or anionic, and that's with the hydrogen dissociated from the molecule. And in the environment, they're found in the anionic form because the hydrogen will dissociate from the chemical in the environment. And so therefore they have a mild negative charge. However, the two forms are really referred to interchangeably, so there's not any difference in how they're referred to, but they do have different chemical and physical properties. So in terms of, so next we'll talk about PFAS occurrence in the environment a little bit. So I think the short answer there is that PFAS generally are everywhere. So everywhere that we've looked for PFAS in the environment, we really have found them. And as I mentioned, the properties that make them useful in industry also make them very environmentally persistent. So they stick around a really long time after they are, after they've migrated into environmental media. They are resistant to biodegradation, photooxidation, photolysis, and hydrolysis. So that's, they don't react with microbial microbes in the environment, or light, or water. So in all those cases, they won't break PFAS down. Um, Long chain PFAS are not volatile, but there are some PFAS in the group that are considered to be potentially volatile. So they can migrate into air in some limited cases. But in the environment, they will usually be found in the soil and in the groundwater. And one thing about PFAS is they're also susceptible to leaching. So if you have, say, like rain falling on the ground, when as that water migrates through the soil to the groundwater, it will migrate, the PFAS will also migrate with it to some extent from the soil media into groundwater. And so that increases the amount of PFAS that are in the water when that happens. PFAS have been detected in essentially all media, so there's the soil, water, and the air. And concentrations would generally be higher in areas where you have the former use or manufacturing of PFAS in that area, but they can often and typically be detected in areas with no known sources of PFAS. So in essence, PFAS is kind of becoming a background condition where it's just present everywhere, even in areas where it's never been used or manufactured or released in some way. So it's really migrated, um, across the globe essentially. So PFAS are also present in other media. So as we mentioned in consumer products, they can be still present in those. They're also present in food. So things grown, of course, food being from things grown in the soil. So PFAS can migrate from soil into foodstuffs and therefore be present in all of those. It's in breast milk. It's also in humans. And then it's still present in commerce. So in certain applications, we still have some manufacturing of PFAS, and then it's also used in manufacturing processes or in industry. So generally, how can people be exposed to PFAS? Well, they can be exposed through the environmental media that contain PFAS. So there's, of course, it's in water. So if you drink water or you're touching water that contains PFAS, you can have exposure to it. So that would be like a potable use scenario. So somebody with, in your home and the tap water contains PFAS, of course, you're drinking it or taking a shower, then you can be exposed to the PFAS that way. Um, you can be exposed to soil containing PFAS. So there's some, if you're gardening or doing athletic activities and you're touching dirt, then there's often some hand to mouth transfer of soil particles. And so that's one way people can be exposed to PFAS, and also dermal contact with the soil. As I mentioned, some PFAS can be volatile, so there could be some air exposures as well, but these are not as well characterized as the soil and water pathways. Of course, then because of its continued use in some industrial applications, there can also be occupational exposure to PFAS, and then exposure to PFAS in consumer products. So I think a big one that's still, out there is like food packaging, or like children on crawling around on a carpet that's been treated with PFAS. That's another potential exposure route. And then food, and then and also breast milk. And it has been shown that fetuses in utero can be exposed to PFAS from the mother. So in people, there are various studies that have collected samples of blood from people, and we have tested the concentrations of PFAS in people's blood. So let's talk about that a little bit. Um, So the first thing is that due to their general persistence, PFAS have a long residence time in the body. So not just in the environment, but also in people. It takes a long time for the body to clear out um, concentrations of PFAS. And so the half-life, so the amount of time it takes for the concentration of a PFAS compound to decrease by one half, is shown there for a select group of PFAS. So you'll see that for a lot of these, the first four are sort of the longer chains. So you have the octanoic and hexanoic and nonanoic versions. And so those are on the order of several years at least. And then the last two are our butanoic and butane sulfonic acids. So those are actually then our short chain. And you'll see there that those residence times, those half-lives, are quite a bit shorter. So that's one reason why the short chains are kind of like thought to be maybe less of an impact, because they do have a much shorter half-life in people. So the body is much faster to clear those out and reduce the concentrations. But on the other hand, we still are dealing with all the long chain PFAS that are around for a really long time. So we'll see here, there actually is, again, some good news due to primarily to the manufacturing, the decreases in the uses in manufacturing of PFAS. So this chart goes back to 1999, showing the levels of PFAS in blood in the American population, and they have decreased substantially. So especially PFOS, we're looking at about a six-fold decrease over the last 20 years. So that's really good news, where we are seeing that these reductions in use of PFAS are having an effect, in that people are having a lower exposure to them. And of course, like some of the PFAS that has been in their system is also being cleared out over time. So it does appear that there's a much lower exposure to PFAS in the population over time. Sorry. And this is also illustrated by some data for specific populations. And so this is looking at PFAS specifically and the average blood levels in various populations. So the highest concentrations are for manufacturing workers, and that was for a population was measured now about 25 years ago. So that was a little while back. And then some of those higher concentrations are also from earlier years in locations where they had PFAS releases, and so people were known to be exposed to PFAS. And then as we go down the bar chart, we can see that the concentrations, of course, are getting generally a bit lower, where now we have some other sites that are more recent, and those people's PFAS levels or PFAS concentrations in their blood are also decreasing. And of course, this also shows the magnitude of the decrease in the general population from 1999 to 2000. Here we had 30, and now the most recent data, it was at 4.3. So there's definitely a substantial decrease in the general population, but also in some exposed populations. So, so that's a good sign. Um, and the same generally goes for PFOA as well. So the highest concentrations again were in manufacturing workers in PFAS, and then some of these older sites had some higher levels, but the general population concentrations have decreased from about 5 to just over 1. So we're seeing about fivefold decrease in the general population in about 20 years. So again, like that's really good, a really good sign that the measures that have been implemented are having an effect. So we'll talk a bit about the human health effects of the PFAS compounds. So for potential short-term hazards, there haven't been a lot of demonstrated specific effects in humans for effects for exposures over the short term. And so so we don't have really any indication that there's sort of like an acute effect where somebody's exposed for something on the order of like a couple days or weeks, and that really causes an effect in people. Most of the short-term studies have been performed using animals, and those studies have observed certain effects such as an altered immune response, mammary gland development, pup survival or development, and other effects like developmental effects. So a lot of reproductive and developmental effects have been observed in animal studies over the short term. And for long-term exposure, and when I say long-term, I'd generally be referring to something on the order of several years to a lifetime. So that's what's considered to be long-term in this context. Some of the effects that have been observed with the specific PFAS with which they're associated are in parentheses. And so those include hypertension, preeclampsia, some increases in the hepatic enzymes, decreases in bilirubin, and then one I think that people maybe have heard about is that it can apparently increase the lipids, the serum lipids, in particular total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. So that's one of the things that has been mentioned um, in the wider information about PFAS is some of those effects. And then another one that's kind of interesting is that, and it's actually the basis for a lot of the toxicity evaluations of PFAS, is this decreased antibody response to vaccines. And so what this means in practice is that there are studies where when people are exposed, especially children, are exposed to have exposure to PFAS, that the level of the antibodies that are present in their blood, as a response to a vaccine, are decreased. And so they're, theoretically have a lower capability of fighting off a potential infection that's related to that vaccine. And so it has decreased their immune response to that vaccine. There's also been observed small decreases in birth weight. And actually, overall, if you look for them, there's essentially studies that suggest potential effects from one or more PFAS on essentially any body system. So they just go everywhere and they can have kind of a multitude of effects. So relative to cancer, the way we talk about cancer is sort of like as a risk, and so your risk of cancer is just kind of is how likely you might be to get cancer in a lifetime. And the various agencies have looked at the carcinogenicity of some PFAS, and the International Agency for Research on Cancer has classified PFOA as possibly carcinogenic and have not reached a determination for PFAS. And then for EPA, they've stated that their conclusion is that there is suggestive evidence of carcinogenicity for both PFOA and PFAS. So they consider both of those potentially carcinogenic. And the types of cancers that have been linked to PFAS are generally testicular and kidney cancers. So, for PFAS, when we're looking at human health and how toxic they are, there are various agencies that have derived criteria for toxicity, and so these are generally thought of as exposure levels that are would not present um, a adverse effect if somebody's exposed to these concentrations over a period of time. And so the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry has what they call minimal risk levels, and they have those for several PFAS that are called intermediate MRLs. And so this represents potential exposures of several weeks to several years. And their MRL values, you can see there range really from 2 times 10 to the minus 5 to 10 to the minus 6 numbers in terms of the levels. And so these are pretty low when it comes to potential toxicity criteria. These are, they're not the lowest numbers that anybody's ever seen for toxicity values, but they are pretty low. And you'll see there exactly what effect each of these numbers, how each of these numbers was derived and what the associated effect is for that. So the other agency that we usually get toxicity values from is the Integrated Risk Information System, which is run by EPA. And so they derive what they call reference doses. And these are all for, again, non-cancer effects. And this, again, is the exposure that a person could have over the course of a lifetime without experiencing an adverse effect. So you'll see that a couple of these are pretty similar to the ATSTR numbers, but then we have PFDA and PFHXS, and now we're looking at levels that are 2 times 10 to the minus 9 and 4 times 10 to the minus 10. So these in particular are extremely low. So, I mean, it's suggesting that very low exposures to these chemicals can have potential adverse effects. The thing about this is some of these, like, you can't even measure concentrations this low. So, it is one thing to like develop a toxicity number, but unfortunately, as it goes, analytically, like in the real world, when we're trying to measure concentrations in the environment, these are going to represent levels that we can't even measure in the environment because we just don't have um, technology that's sensitive enough to detect them. So it's like it might be toxic, but we can't even tell if people are being exposed to these concentrations associated with these tox values because we can't measure them. So kind of a little bit of a rock and a hard place where we can't, we have the numbers, but we can't even tell if, what people's exposure is relative to that number. All right. So we are moving on. So I'll talk about PFAS regulation. So I'm just going to cover in brief some of the US regulations that apply to PFAS. So there is first of all, there's the Toxic Substances Control Act, and EPA has taken a rather substantial number of actions under TSCA to regulate the production and use of PFAS. And so here I just actually put the link because there's so many that I actually, we could do a whole talk just on TSCA and PFAS. So they've been doing a lot there. Primarily, though, this has been in the form of a significant new use rule, and so this limits how certain PFAS can be used. And so it's literally a regulation that tells people how PFAS can be used and really limits that use. So, as we kind of alluded to in prior discussions, there are many restrictions now on the use and the import and the manufacture of many PFAS. So that has greatly reduced their use in the United States. There's also something called the Chemical Data Reporting Rule under TSCA, which requires manufacturers to provide EPA with information on the production and use of chemicals in commerce. And so PFAS are some of those chemicals that they report on. And so that way they can understand the volume of PFAS that are being used and imported. There's also the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and so this primarily regulates disposal. And there are two proposed regulations under RECRA regarding PFAS, and these would add 9 PFAS to the list of RECRA hazardous constituents. And so in that case, like when a constituent is considered hazardous, it imposes certain requirements on their disposal and shipping that chemical. And so there's additional levels of documentation that are required, and it can only be disposed of in certain facilities. So that would limit, it would limit the disposal of PFAS potentially into, say, like just municipal landfills and things like that. Um, so that we'll stay tuned to see, since those were just proposed last year, they haven't been finalized. And so we'll see what happens to those and if they end up in their final form in the same as they're proposed. There's also the toxics release inventory. So TRI helps EPA track releases of chemicals to the environment, and so it requires facilities and people who use those chemicals at a certain quantity to report that information to EPA when those chemicals are released to the environment. And so they did collect data on PFAS under the TRI in 2021, and they're also putting out the rules they put out in 2023 um, requires additional facilities to report on PFAS because they removed a exemption for small quantities. So now you're going to have more facilities that are required to report on PFAS, and so then we'll be able to see. There's actually, I believe, a TRI mapper in the website, so you can go online and see nearby facilities and see what they release and how much. So that way, provide better information to people on which facilities are using PFAS and if they're released from that facility. So they also added 7 other PFAS to the list of chemicals covered by TRI. So again, there'll be more and more reporting on PFAS under this rule. And the TRI reporting is required for those chemicals for the 2024 year. So those data should be coming in to the system pretty soon. The Safe Drinking Water Act as we know, regulates chemicals in drinking water. And so the first PFAS drinking water regulations were promulgated last year, about almost a year ago. And they have them for six specific PFAS chemicals: PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS, PFNA, and HFPODA, which you may know better as Gen X. So that's a newer generation of PFAS chemical. There are specific maximum contaminant levels that apply to PFOA and PFOS. So that the MCLs are the limit of the concentration of chemical at the drinking water supply that they have to meet that threshold in order to be in compliance. So the other four PFAS, they've actually taken a slightly different approach, and I'll talk about that in a minute, just to show you what that looks like, because it is a really unique approach to drinking water compliance, and it uses what's called a hazard index approach. And so it accounts for the combined co-occurrence of multiple of these PFAS in the drinking water. It's sort of like a summary concentration, but each one has a different concentration threshold, and so it allows for a combination of those um, to reach a certain, to demonstrate compliance. So we'll see what that looks like. Um, so for the drinking water standards, as I mentioned, for PFOA and PFOS, they have MCLs. Their MCL is 4 nanograms per liter, which is 4 parts per trillion. Again, very, very low concentration. And in fact, they have a maximum contaminant level goal of 0. And that's because EPA has made a policy decision that the MCLG for carcinogens is set to 0. However, the MCLGs are, of course, goals, and they're not enforceable drinking water standards, so they're only there as kind of a placeholder, and they can't enforce like a 0 level at a drinking water system. So because that 0 level is not technically achievable, then they also develop an enforceable MCL. In this case, they've defaulted to the lowest concentration that's able to be reliably detected in a laboratory setting. And so for these chemicals, that value is 4 ppt, and thus that is the MCL for these chemicals. So for the other four, this is just a little extract from EPA's fact sheet on the drinking water standards that shows how this hazard index approach works. And so the general concept is that each of these four PFAS has a health-based toxicity or a health-based water value. And so you can see those in the denominators here. So for 3 of those, that value is 10 ppt, and then for PFBS, it's 2000. And so what you can do is you take your concentration of each of those PFAS and put them in these equations, and then you calculate what's called an hazard index. That's sort of the summary of the risk of all of these put together. And so that way it kind of can apportion, depending on the mix of the concentrations of these various chemicals, then you can see whether you're at or below your hazard index of 1, which would mean that you're in compliance. And so if we think about this and say, if you only have one of these detected, then they could be detected at concentrations up to their health-based value, and that would still be in compliance. And then if you had, say, like PFNA and PFHXS, and they were each detected at 5 ppt, then that would also be in compliance because each of them would contribute 1/2 to this hazard index. So it's just a way to um, combine the potential detected PFAS and into one point of compliance for all of them together. So and this is definitely unique amongst the drinking water regulations. There are no other chemicals that use this approach. So it's been kind of a little bit of a difference. Like somebody's, it's like something that people have never seen before. So it's definitely, interesting way to do this. Not that it's not valid. It's a valid way, but it's just very different than what EPA has done previously for drinking water regulations. So now we've talked about all of that. I want to talk about what can we do about PFAS in the environment, because as we've seen, it's very persistent, it's pretty toxic, and so ideally we'd like to remove as much as possible from the environment to prevent people from being exposed to it. So just as a sort of general concept, the first step we really want to try and do is remove the PFAS from whatever medium it's in to the extent feasible. So, from soil, like can we get it out of the soil, or water? Like we want to remove it from the water so that we can do something to the PFAS, and then we still have the water and soil that we can use, and we don't have to like dispose of it just because it contains PFAS. And once you get it out of that medium, you can dispose of PFAS in a couple different ways. They can go to certain landfills. And so, typically a landfill would have some sort of liner and a leachate collection system. So that would prevent the PFAS, generally speaking, from reaching the wider environment, and would, keep it within the landfill. They also can be incinerated, so they can burn. Like they will, if they are incinerated, they will decompose. And so that is one way to get rid of them, but it is a bit of an energy intensive disposal method. So because of PFAS' unique properties, there are many traditional remedial options that are not effective. So some of your traditional drinking water treatment methods like disinfection and oxidation just have no effect whatsoever on PFAS because of their stability. Um, there are many effective technologies. So I've just listed some here. Like you can use an ion exchange resin so that the PFAS is, attached to the resin. High pressure membranes can be used to remove the PFAS from water. Granular activated carbon, which you probably are familiar with, like Brita filters are granular activated carbon, so those can be effective at removing PFAS. And reverse osmosis, and also something called foam fractionation, which is where they kind of like create PFAS bubbles and remove the PFAS that way. So it's kind of a fun one to look at. But the key thing about all of these is they just remove the PFAS. So they just transfer the PFAS from the medium to like something else, like the resin or to the GAC. So now instead of having PFAS in your water or your soil, now you have it in something else. So yes, you've removed it, but you still haven't actually done anything to the PFAS. And so when we think about, so in terms of destruction of PFAS, that's really the area that, is kind of a focus where we want to get rid of it. And so some of the ways that we have identified that can destroy PFAS are, as I mentioned, incineration. There also, it can be degraded using photolysis under certain conditions. So, like, although under normal environmental conditions, light won't destroy PFAS, it can be modified so that you can use some, light applications to destroy them. Zero valent iron, so that will actually break down the carbon fluorine bonds in PFAS. So that is an effective destruction method. And also in some cases, biodegradation, so using microbes, where the microbes will also break down the PFAS, is another viable alternative that is sort of definitely an emerging area of research. So what's next for PFAS? There is a lot of uncertainty about the future of some of the proposed actions that are out there in the government. So, like I mentioned, some of those rules that we talked about are proposals, and so they aren't final yet. And so it's unclear what's going to happen with those, sort of under the current state of the state. Um, I would say that regulations that are already in place, such as the drinking water standards, it's usually a challenge to change those or roll them back to any major extent, just because they are promulgated. So then it would take another act or another regulation to change that. And once the regulated community kind of gets used to a type of regulation and they're sort of set up to comply with regulations, it can be, almost harder to go back because now they've already invested money in, complying with the regulation and all that stuff. So um, I think that's just my perspective on that. I'm not going to predict the future in that, but just it's definitely harder to change or roll back regulations. Um, I think we'll see a lot more research into treatment and remediation options. There's a lot of government funded studies that are working on this and also in academia. So it's a very big research area, research focus. And then we may also see additional toxicity assessments for certain PFAS. There's one assessment that's in the final stages in IRIS, so that's for PFNA. And so it's really in the very last step before finalizing. And so we should see that become final, as in the relatively near future. But there aren't any other PFAS that are kind of in the pipeline for toxicity assessments, at least at IRIS. So we'll have to stay tuned and see if any of further ones are developed. So just to conclude, um, you know, some of the top level observations, as I mentioned, PFAS, they're man-made chemicals. They have been very useful in commerce. Unfortunately, their persistence while making them valuable has led to a lot of consequences to the environment and public health. They're now everywhere, and they have been found to cause toxic effects, including cancer. So as a result, we do have a lot of regulations and restrictions on PFAS use in manufacture, and this has fortunately had the effect of reducing those levels in people, especially in the past 20 years. So that's really good progress. And there are a lot of studies that are ongoing, and frequently there are new discoveries. So keep your eyes open, and you might see some of those in news someday soon. So I think that here I just put a slide for you with some further reading and resources from various US and international governmental sources. So if you want to learn more about PFAS, there's plenty out there, um, plenty of places to do that. So and thank you so much for the opportunity to present today. I really appreciate your time and attention. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much. So we do have some time for some questions. So
Okay.
if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A. And to start off, our first question is, what can people do to reduce their possible exposure to PFAS?
Yep. Yeah, it is a challenge because because they're everywhere. So, there's going to be some level of exposure kind of no matter where you are to some extent and what you do. But like I think looking at like the food packaging one is interesting to me. Well, sorry, I should start off like water is probably like the top thing. So, like one thing is if you use a private well, where you're not on a public water system, you can get you probably can you should be able to get your water tested and see if it has any PFAS in it and what those concentrations are, because that's really that's like a direct exposure. When you think about water, like everybody has to drink water and ingest, everybody needs water to survive. And so water is kind of a low-hanging fruit. Um, where like if you are, you do have PFAS in the water that's coming into your home, then that's like a good place to start because it's something that you can fix with like an RO filter or something like that. and pretty easily, and that is like a major exposure. And then food's kind of a tough one because there's not really a way to sort of know if your food contains PFAS or reduce really your exposure because it's not a pesticide. So like kind of using buying organic doesn't really change that, because it's not really related to anything that's applied to the food. Um, but like I said, I mentioned earlier, like food packaging, like looking for things that have like that coated paperboard, I think is kind of a big factor there. So kind of maybe like avoiding those if possible, might help reduce some exposure. So those are some of the big things. But I really think water is kind of a main one. And the good news is that with the MCLs, with now having drinking water regulations, then all the public water systems will be required to meet those. So that it is likely to reduce people's exposure from that pathway.
Okay, this next question is two parts. So if you need me to read it again, just let me
Okay, yeah.
know. It says, could fertilizer be a significant source of PFAS considering it is derived from synthetic or natural chemicals? And then the second part is, how can we identify PFAS in our environment, consumer products, and soil?
Right. Um, right. So fertilizer. I'm not an expert on fertilizer production. I mean, I know some chemistry, but I think I would venture to. I'm not sure about the use of PFAS, like say in fertilizer manufacturing itself. I'm thinking it's like might be less likely. But I mean, if it was present and they were using it, like if it is in the fertilizer and that's getting applied to, crops and things, then there's no reason that the PFAS couldn't end up in the food and the soil where it's applied. So I like in the hypothetical case that there is some PFAS in that fertilizer manufacturing process, then yes, like it would just go um end up there. So I'm not sure that I'm not, you might be able to find some information, like you could just, look up and see if anybody has any information on the, whether PFAS have been found in fertilizer products. But I don't know about that personally. I can only say, if you put it on the ground, it will probably end up in the soil and the water, and the food, the stuff that's growing there. Um, yes, so I think I have, let's see, let me just remember if I remember the second
Yeah, I
part.
can read the second one. So it
Okay.
says, how can we identify
Mm,
PFAS in our environment, consumer products, and soil?
right. So you're definitely not really gonna be able to tell with your soil because if it's in the soil, it's just there, and like there's nothing you can really do to say like, oh, this soil contains PFAS and this soil doesn't. I mean, you can send it to a lab and get it tested, but it's not really like something that somebody's going to commonly do. So, and I'm just gonna say like the levels that we usually see in soil are generally speaking, unless it's like one of those releases, like there was a fire and they used the AFFF, the firefighting foam. Most soil concentrations are really quite low, so soil isn't typically like a major exposure route, that I would be, more that I would be really concerned about. So like in terms of consumer products and that sort of stuff, there is a consumer products database that is, I just can't remember which government organization hosts it, but if you again like search it up, it should come up really, really quickly. And I guess I'm just not sure if PFAS is one of the things that's in that consumer products database. So, but that database has the consumer products and you can look for certain chemicals and find out if that chemical is present in, in what consumer products that chemical is present in, or you can look up a particular product that you have and see if, see what chemicals are in it. Um, and, that's mostly like, I'm thinking like cleaners, paints, that sort of stuff. If it's, packaging, that's going to be, I think, almost impossible to be able to tell. Um, so I couldn't, you can't really know how much PFAS is in there. So in that case, it's really just a matter of like trying your best to reduce your exposure to that as a category. And if that's something that you're concerned about.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so with that, we are out of
Oh,
time today. If you have any other questions or anything, you can email me and I'll put it in the chat. And I can definitely get those over to Jane and she can answer those at a different time to make sure that if any questions came up, that we definitely get to those. But with that, I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. We had a really large group, so it was a very interesting topic. And thank you so much, especially to Jane for presenting on it. We really appreciate it. And I really hope I'll see everyone else next month at our next webinar Wednesday. So thank you.
thanks, Ashley.